Welcome to Wind of the Tao podcast. This is David Marshall. Wind of the Tao. Last time we talked about the Tao, Taoism, Lao Zi, the Dao De Jing. How does Christianity relate to other religions? This time we're going to concentrate on the vital question, is God the Tao? Is the Tao a synonym for the supreme God of so-called Western religion? Now, cat ladies reportedly have pet cats. I have pet peeves. And one of my pet peeves is this concept of Eastern religion and Western religion. Rudyard Kipling said, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. The concept of Eastern religion gives you this idea that there is something in Asia, some sort of religion that is unique to that area and that typifies pretty much everybody who lives there. But Asians are 60% of humanity, divided by swamps, seas, deserts, jungles, the Himalaya friggin' mountains, and all these different languages you see on this map, along with cuisines. The idea that they share one religion is pretty ridiculous. And Western religion, I don't know if that includes Africa or not. Certainly the North and South America, one would assume, and Western Europe, or Europe in general. East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. And that's the concept that a lot of people have. These two halves of the world, two hemispheres of the world, are rigidly separated ideologically. And we have something called Eastern religion, whatever that is, as if India and China even were very similar in their traditions. But people forget the next part of Rudyard Kipling's poem, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. This carries the idea that whatever the ultimate truth is, there really can only be one ultimate truth. We all look at the same sky at nighttime. If I rise on the wings of the dawn and settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, according to the psalmist in Psalm 139. So if you get on your 777, you fly 14 hours to the other side of the world, according to that verse anyway, you don't quite escape God's jurisdiction. Tao, God, ultimate truth. What is the relationship between these two ideas? In the beginning was the Tao, says the translator of the Gospel of John. The Tao was with God, the Tao was God. Is that a mistranslation? Is that cultural appropriation? Is that paganism? In 1989, a young philosophy grad student by the name of Yuan Zhiming helped to produce a TV series and a book called The River Elegy. And The River Elegy was about the Yellow River in China, and it retold the story of China, basically saying that China needed to flow to the deep blue sea. It needed to escape the confines of river sediment and accumulated rubbish in Chinese culture, and needed to join with the rest of the world. Yuan Zhiming was an idealist. He was a communist. But after the Tiananmen Massacre in 1989, he escaped China by means of a speedboat going to Hong Kong. Then he went on to Paris, and then he wound up in Princeton, New Jersey, where he fell in with a group of Chinese intellectuals who were studying the New Testament together. He was very impressed by their character, and he connected it because he was a philosopher and he had studied Chinese tradition. He connected it to the philosophy of the Dao De Jing, and he began to think about, first of all, the character of Jesus Christ, and secondly, the relationship between Jesus and Lao Zi. So he wrote a book later on called Lao Zi versus the Bible, pictured on the left here. And in that book, he basically offered two hypotheses or theses. Number one, Tao in the Bible is in fact an image of God. Number two, Lao Zi recognized Jesus from a distance and foretold his coming. Well, they may sound like ridiculous theses, but these are are actually the subjects that I studied in my doctoral dissertation. I analyzed his argument. I analyzed his opponents, people who disagreed with him and kind of rebuked him even. And I came to my own conclusions about these two questions. Today we're going to be talking about the first one. Is the Tao God? In so-called Western religion, we have the idea of God, the creator. In so-called Eastern religion, or one form of it, we have the idea of the Tao. How can two ultimates relate to one another? Is the Tao materialistic, pantheistic, pagan? Is it cultural appropriation to borrow this concept to describe the supreme God? Now, there's a kind of an irony here, because Christian exclusivists and modern Taoists, even though they disagree on most everything else, they agree that this is a kind of a sacrilege to connect Tao and God. Prior question: how do we define anything? How do we define grapes, for example, or clouds, or mosquitoes, or anything? I think there's 6 ways to define a term, which we can also apply to the Tao. We can define a word by its etymology, the root meanings of the word. We can use classification to say what category it belongs to. A dog is a kind of mammal. We can describe its traits or actions. A dog wags its tail. We can describe a word by its synonyms: dog, wolf, puppy, mutt. Common usage, or we can appeal to authority. For example, we can open the dictionary. By epistemology, Lao Zi means master, old master. By classification, he was one of the ancient Chinese sages during the Warring States period before Qin Shi Huang united China in 2000 BC. By his actions, well, he wrote the Dao De Jing, supposedly. By synonyms, we can say that Mr. Li is another name for Lao Zi. Let's begin with the argument against identifying Tao and God, and then we'll look at the argument for identifying the Tao with God, and then I'll offer some final conclusions. Arguments against. First, we can look at etymology. Every culture, some would say, is unique. And every supreme hero or God is the product of cultural evolution. Now, we know that Joseph Campbell wrote about the hero of 10,000 faces. But in fact, Santa Claus and Superman, even though they're within the same culture, even though they both start with the letter S, they're quite a bit different from one another. But this rather begs the question, because if the Tao or God is ultimate, it must by definition transcend culture. Now, looking at this from the point of view of anthropology, in 1900, an anthropologist by the name of Andrew Lang, who's also a very famous writer, wrote a book called The Makings of Religion. And in The Makings of Religion, he argued that there was an image of a supreme God and a conception of a supreme God in cultures around the world, especially among primitive peoples. So the so-called God of Abrahamic religions, as we often put it, is not in fact confined to Israel or Arabia or Western Europe or wherever we describe the God of the West. But actually you can find him in Tierra del Fuego, in North America, among North American Indians, in Australia, in many parts of Asia. How about usage? In fact, the Tao is generally taken to mean in ancient Chinese literature the way or speak, usually a path or road, but sometimes to speak, as I explained last time. Sometimes it might mean principles or truth. It doesn't mean God. And then in the Dao De Jing, we see the Tao translated as nature, as reason, as truth, integrity, very often translated as the way, and even more often perhaps transliterated just as Tao or Dao, T-A-O, D-A-O. However, there have been some scholars who have seen the concept of God and the concept of the Tao as being congruent in many ways. Maybe not completely the same, but as having some areas of congruity. For example, James Legge, the Victorian translator of China, who is still considered perhaps the greatest scholar of ancient Chinese religion. John Wu, who wrote the Constitution for the Nationalists, which is still in effect in Taiwan. He was a lawyer, and he also saw areas of congruence, as we will see, between the idea of the Tao and of God. And of course, Yuan Zhiming, whom we're talking about today, he went beyond that and said, actually, Lao Zi was talking about God in some sense. And then we have the term Tian Dao, which we find in the Dao De Jing. We'll talk about it later. Tian meaning heaven, Dao meaning the way of heaven. Tian is also a very, very commonly a theistic term in ancient Chinese thought before the Dao De Jing. So the way of heaven, the way of God, these two terms are soldered together in a very interesting way, as we will see. So we can't just say the word is never used in a theistic sense. It's a little more complicated than that. Well, synonyms. The Tao is not usually used, some would argue, as a synonym for Shangdi, the word for God in ancient China, or Tian in those older texts. Characteristics. Many people would argue from the characteristics of the Dao De Jing that no, we can't possibly be talking about God here. Looking first of all at chapter 5, which we talked about last time, heaven and earth are not humane, but treat all things like straw dogs. The sage is not humane, but treats this people like straw dogs. And Chen argues, this implies that heaven and earth have nothing more than a physical and actual existence and do not partake of human emotions. Citing Wang Bi and He Shanggong, he argues that Lao Zi wholly rejects the theistic projection of human sentiment on the universe that had been the norm in China. He admits that there was this norm before Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, in favor of a mechanistic interpretation of the natural processes. Sorry, this is not going to work as an argument. First of all, because some ancient texts of the Dao De Jing don't actually have chapter 5. But the bigger problem is that we can't interpret the entire Dao De Jing from this one chapter and ignore the rest, as we talked about last time. Others argue from authority and say, for example, as a professor of Chinese culture at National Taipei University of Education put it, we have known that the Tao in Lao Zi is impersonal. We have known. Well, if the Tao is impersonal, then it can't be God. Because by definition, God in Christian thought, even in Islamic thought, in Jewish thought, is a personal God, a God who has thoughts, plans, and a certain character. And then others would argue against identifying these two concepts from biblical grounds. They would say that, according to the Bible, the gods of the heathen are idols, false gods. And in general, that seems to be the case in much of the Bible. But then we come to a place in the book of Acts where St. Paul travels to this very center, the very cradle of Greek-Roman culture, the city of Athens, and he speaks at a very renowned location in the city of Athens, Mars Hill. And in the speech he gives there to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, he not only uses the Greek term for God, theos, and not only does he do that, but he seems to borrow Stoic apologetics. For example, if you look at Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, and you follow the argument by the Stoic philosopher in that book, it's very similar to how Paul argues in Acts 17. And this is the longest speech to pagans in the entire New Testament. So we can't assume that the Bible is going to forbid us to find any parallels to God in other cultures. Let's look at the argument for identifying God and the Tao. I will discuss 15 characteristics that Yuan brings up in the Dao De Jing, which seem to imply that the Tao has a personality. First of all, Yuan argues that the Tao is self-existent. Man takes his law from earth, earth from heaven, heaven from the Tao. Tao takes its law from self-actuality. We talked about this last time. Self-actuality, what does that mean? 自然, Dao Fa 自然. Rump and Chan translate this passage. The Tao models itself after nature. So here's a very direct conflict. Is it self-actuality or is it nature? But elsewhere in the Dao De Jing, 自然 is translated as spontaneous in chapter 51 or without acting in chapter 64, not nature. Even Ames and Young, and Ames is kind of a critic of finding God in ancient China, translate this passage, the Tao emulates that which is natural to it. Self-existence is apparently ascribed to the Tao in the Dao De Jing, a quality which for theists belongs to God alone. In fact, the first premise of the cosmological argument is every finite and contingent being has a cause. In other words, there's two categories of things. There are finite and contingent beings, and there are infinite and non-contingent beings. And for theists, there's only one in the second category, and that is God. Well, apparently, according to the Dao De Jing, there's only one in that second category of infinite and non-contingent beings, and that is the Tao. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, one would think. So this seems to be a fairly strong argument for recognizing the Tao and God as in some ways analogous. Number two, Yuan argues that the Tao is also a creator. Does the Tao create? In chapters 42 and chapter 52, we see hints of this. In chapter 52, Lao Zi writes of a beginning. Tao is called father, mother, root, and ancestor, and said to give birth to the 1, 2, 3, and then all things. Sheng here is translated by different people as give birth, produce, or passively is born. However, according to a Hong Kong theology professor, according to ancient Chinese usage in the intended cultural background, the word sheng, give birth or multiplying in verse 42:1 is not the equivalent of zao, to create something out of nothing in the Bible. This is an argument from authority, according to ancient Chinese usage and attendant cultural background. Well, why? Let's look at some of that ancient Chinese usage, and we'll see that this is actually rather simplistic. Zhuangzi several times uses the word zao to describe the creator's work, and as we saw, Zhuangzi was the co-founder of Taoism with Lao Zi. He used the word zao to describe the creator, Zao Wu, and the creator's work. By contrast, Paul cites Aratus, for we also are his offspring. Being then the offspring, genos, of God. So while Chinese Taoists can talk about of creating, Christians like St. Paul could talk about God giving birth to humanity. There are elements of emergence and creation in standard Big Bang accounts. So this kind of makes a little bit of sense when we get beyond these metaphors, because obviously Paul didn't think that God physically had a womb and pushed out a bunch of human beings, and neither did the Taoists think that the Tao gave birth to the 1, the 2, the 3, and then all things in the physical sense. Zhuangzi's character, the cripple Ziyu, says, oh my master, you're older than the highest antiquity without being aged. You brood over and sustain the whole universe and carve all things into an infinite variety of forms without resorting to artificial skill. This is what I would call the joy of heaven. Again, the term heaven can mean the skies, and it can also mean the supreme being. John Wu, the author of the Chinese Constitution, the Nationalist Constitution, points out that Zhuangzi used Tian and Tao interchangeably. Both terms designate the one ne plus ultra. John was a lawyer, so he liked to throw in a little French. But when viewing it as the creator, he usually calls it heaven, which is equivalent to God. But since one cannot firmly distinguish between God and his attributes, Tao can also be called creator. Now, this is looking at some of the axial age texts from China. Zhuangzi, Lao Zi, maybe Confucius. But if we go back several hundred years and look at that attendant cultural background, as this professor said, then we have to see what the book of history and the book of poetry say about these terms, create and give birth. They never use the word zao in the fully biblical sense of creation out of nothing, and seldom to describe the work of the high God. In the book of poetry, sheng, give birth, refers to the action of the Supreme Being in originating humanity, but the Tao never does. Though in the commentary on the third hexagram of the I Ching, heaven is said to create plants. Poem called The Multitudes, which is one of the later poems, Tian gave birth to the multitudes of people. It's not clear that any ancient Chinese had a full conception of creation from nothing. But they do use the same verb for the creative activity of Shangdi Tian in earlier texts of God, as Lao Zi uses in the Dao De Jing, giving birth to the 1, 2, 3, and all things. So the same vocabulary is used in the ancient Chinese classics and in the Dao De Jing for the creative activity of whether it's Shangdi or whether it's the Dao. So this is, I think, a fairly strong argument also for seeing the Dao as a kind of synonym for God. There are some intimations of creation in the Dao De Jing, maybe not quite as clear as Genesis 1, for example. What about Dao as a trinity? Now, this is really a kind of a wild thought that Yuan introduces. Well, the Tao gives birth to the 1, 2, and 3. The 3 give birth to all things, and Yuan thinks this is kind of a Trinitarian passage. He also argues that there's an organic Trinitarian pattern throughout the Dao De Jing. Now, I think his argument on this score is idiosyncratic and a bit subjective, but it is interesting that Lao Zi described creation in terms of 3. Don Richardson's term redemptive analogy might apply to this faint suggestion of Trinity, which is no doubt unconsciously invoked. Number 4, personality. Here's a key question. Is the Tao personal? Yuan admits that the Tao is not as personal as the God of the Bible. However, he points to 19 chapters that do either use names or qualities, nouns or adjectives, to describe the Tao, which do kind of imply personality. Mother, faithful, merciful, powerful, loving, has authority, rewards and punishes, civilizes, is righteous, forgives, and saves. All this, he argues, is not what we would call anthropomorphism, or they're just being anthropomorphic. They're just ascribing these human qualities to the Tao, which kind of begs the question again. Because according to Yuan Zhiming, maybe it is not that we are ascribing personal qualities, human qualities to the divine. Maybe we are created in the image of God, and therefore we are theomorphs. We are morphed or formed in the image of God, or Taomorphs, formed in the image of the Tao. An open question, but let's look at some of the details, and then it becomes rather interesting. Rewards and punishes is one of the characteristics that Yuan ascribed to the Tao. Let's take a look at that. The Dao De Jing 73, God's way, according to Blakeney, this is how he translated it, does not contend but is adept at victory. The master plan unfolds slowly, its mesh wide, but unfolding all, so nothing is lost. Dui Vidak doesn't like his translation, God's way. He says, no, this is what we would call the laws of nature. Chen Guiying agrees with Duvidik, how you pronounce his name, refers to the natural laws on which the cosmos operates. Lao Zi considers that the laws of nature are flexible in the sense that they are conducive to the natural development of all things. Further, these laws preserve a balance in the cosmos in which all things are complementary to each to the other. As such, they do not allow of contention or conflict. Man in his conduct should seek to emulate these laws. But the Tao is adept at victory. And really, this doesn't sound like survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw. The Tao is responding and planning. These actually sound like the sentient virtues of a sage founder. The Tao sounds a lot like a sage here. The sage is, by definition, a human being. Why does the Tao share the same characteristics as the sage founder? Is it only because the sage founder is copying the laws of nature, or is it because the sage founder is looking for something higher and has a character which reflects this divine character. One who presides over the infliction of death. Legge translates Dao De Jing 74. A great carpenter. So the Tao is described as one, a master carpenter, and as chief executioner. Really sounds more like somebody than something. Zhuangzi also used this term, master carpenter. Lao Zi's point seems to be similar. There is one judge over us all, with powers of life and death. So, Lao Zi's point is he's writing to rulers, so rulers should not intimidate subjects by mass executions. Don't go around killing everybody, just to scare the chicken. Zhuangzi's reflections in the background, for Lao Zi too, it seems that the Tao's power to end life does not preclude benevolence. In other words, in the Psalms, the psalmist cries out to God and mourns his sad fate, as Job does in the book of Job. We get the same sorts of expressions in the ancient classics of China, and they seem also to be reflected in this passage of the Tao De Jing. So I think this is a fairly strong argument that the Tao is not just an impersonal force of nature. What about loving? Is the Tao loving? Which would completely conflict with the idea that the Tao is just the laws of nature, as in chapter 5 is usually interpreted. In the Dao De Jing 34, the great Tao clothes and nourishes all things, but does not make itself lord over them. Dui Vedak actually uses the word love here. The Tao loves all things. Now, an impersonal object may seem to clothe and nourish. At one point in the book Perelandra by C.S. Lewis, the planet Venus seems to feed the hero by providing grapes right next to the cave that he emerges from after fighting the unman. So an impersonal object may, by analogy, be said to clothe and nourish, but not affecting lordship really sounds intentional. And it also sounds a lot like the sage. This is the characteristic described to the sage, even in the classics before Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing. Chapter 67. Legge translates the last 15 or so characters of chapter 7. Gentleness. The word gentleness here is tsi, which is often translated in the Old Testament as loving kindness, and is used 4 times here. Gentleness is sure to be victorious even in battle, and firmly to maintain its ground. Heaven will save its possessor by his very gentleness protecting him. Now the word gentleness here, tsi, is also translated as love by several translators, forbearance, compassion, pity, or commiseration. Lao Zi begins this chapter by describing the greatness of the Tao, and ends by speaking of how Tian, or heaven, will save one with compassion, the very quality that the Tao values. Now Chen interprets the Tian here, the heaven, as the laws of nature. Blakeney says God. But the relationship between Tian and Tao, heaven and the way, is similar to that between Shangdi and Tian in the classics. There's a seamless movement from Tian, from heaven, and the Tao here in this chapter that very much suggests identity. It seems like heaven and the Tao are the same thing, and it seems that they are, in fact, as Yuan argues, compassionate and benevolent. Yuan argues that the final verse in Dao De Jing 81, the final verse in the whole book, as a matter of fact, also depicts the Tao as loving. This chapter compares the action of the Tao to the sage and ends in Lao's words, "The way of heaven benefits and does not harm. The way of the sage is bountiful and does not contend." 3 elements suggest personality here. The parallel between the sage and the Tao again, the potentially theistic term heaven, and the choice of helping rather than harming. Just the opposite again, just the opposite again to conventional interpretations of chapter 5. So, is the Tao in the Dao De Jing another word for God? Yuan Zhiming so far has argued from 6 different characteristics in the Dao De Jing that indeed the Tao is another word for God. At least they're not complete absolute synonyms, but they're pretty close. Yuan argues that the Tao is self-existent, that the Tao is a creator of some sort, that the Tao is Trinitarian, has a personality, that the Tao rewards and punishes, and that the Tao is rewarding and punishing by the criteria of benevolence, that the Tao, in fact, is loving. 7th, and this will be the last main characteristic that I'm going to discuss, and I'll throw out a few others, and we'll draw some broader implications from this study of the Dao De Jing. Yuan argues that the Tao is also righteous. In particular, Yuan cites chapter 77. Is not the way of heaven like bending a bow? The high part is lowered, and the low part is raised up. Those with much lose, those who lack gain. The way of man is different. He takes from those who lack to gorge himself. This is my rather rough translation, but fairly literal. So the Tao is like bending a bow, lowering the wealthy and raising the poor. By contrast, humans don't act that way. Humans tend to oppress the poor. However, the sage should emulate the way of heaven and serve all under heaven, all under Tian. Chan and Chen Guiying interpret Tian Dao here as nature and the natural order of the universe. Blakeney says, by contrast, God. Well, it can't be both at the same time. A bow is inanimate, and thus may suggest an undirected process, granted. But nature, red in tooth and claw, does not, in fact, in our biological experience of the world around us, prefer the weak to the strong. In fact, that choice suggests consciousness and character. Now, here's a passage which is disputed, but I think very interesting and very telling. Chapter 79, which James Legge translates, the last part of chapter 79, in the way of heaven there is no partiality of love. It is always on the side of the good man. Now, this chapter actually begins by talking about the character of the Tao, and then it transitions into talking about, then Lao Zi transitions into talking about the way of heaven. In the way of heaven, there's no partiality of love. It's always on the side of the good man. Chen Guiying says, the expression shows no partiality has the same meaning as the phrase, heaven and earth are amoral in Dao De Jing 5. As I said, some people interpret the whole Dao De Jing by this one chapter, chapter 5. Both are concepts depicting an indifferent natural force as the essential structure of the cosmos. But that's not going to work. This phrase, Tian Dao Wu Qin, the way of heaven is without bias, shows no partiality, was already, as Lin Yutang said, an ancient quotation appearing in many ancient texts. I'll give you a few examples of that. Remember, we're looking back now hundreds of years before the Dao De Jing. This is the cultural context of the Dao De Jing. In the book of history, heaven is without prejudice, using the same term Wu Qin, but ascribing it to heaven, not to the Tao. The ways of Shangdi are not invariable. This is using a slightly different Chinese phrase, Buchang, instead of Wuqin. The ways of heaven, of God, are not invariable, since he punishes the evil and rewards the good. The mandate of heaven cannot be taken for granted. August heaven has no partiality. This is again using the same term from the Dao De Jing hundreds of years earlier, but applying it not to the Tao, but to heaven, and using the adjective huang, or august, to describe heaven. This adjective is often used to describe God in ancient Chinese classics. And even if you go to Beijing and you visit the altar of heaven in the center of Beijing, you will find, first of all, as you go into the front gate, you'll see a sign in English put up there by the Chinese Communist government, which describes the altar of heaven as a place where the God of heaven was worshipped. If you go into the altar of heaven, Well, you can't get inside anymore, but you used to be able to go right inside. And there was a little plaque inside of the altar of heaven, the uh, altar of prayer for a good harvest is what it's technically called. Inside of that, there's a little plaque that says Huang Tian Shang Di. Huang Tian, august heaven, Shang Di, the word God added onto it. These two were combined to refer to the supreme being in ancient China. Here, this term august heaven acts the same way as the Tao in the Dao De Jing. The same verbs are being used here, wu qin, lacking any partiality. The Book of Poetry, also, the other ancient Chinese text that we look to for the cultural context, in probably the most famous of the later groups of the Book of Poetry, the later poems in the Book of Poetry, King One, there is a phrase that says, the mandate of heaven is not constant. In other words, the calling of the supreme being upon a king will change depending on how the king acts. If the king is a scoundrel, then he will be overthrown. If a king is righteous, then he will be supported. These passages closely parallel Dao De Jing 77, and they mean just the opposite of heaven is amoral. Lao Zi could not have been ignorant of the sentiment of so important a stock phrase and concept in ancient China. I would say this is a smoking gun, showing that he clearly saw the Tao as a just deity, parallel to and probably the same as Tian/Shangdi. And also adds that the Tao is a savior in Dao De Jing 67. The Dao De Jing, heaven, as Lin Yutang puts it, heaven arms with love those it would not see destroyed. Does that sound like the indifferent flows of the laws of nature? I don't think so. You can add some other characteristics that I think also support this interpretation. He argues a little bit ambivalently that the Tao is eternal in at least 3 passages. The word Chang can be interpreted that way, but usually it's not, even in the Dao De Jing. Faithful, graceful, powerful, has authority, teaches, and forgives. So in sum, according to Yuan Zhiming's argument, and with a lot of supporting passages in the Dao De Jing, the Tao is self-existent and perhaps eternal. Personal metaphors are often used for it. Mother, ancestor, judge, carpenter. The Tao originates nature in some sense parallel to heaven, giving birth. It also parents the political order as well, just as Shangdi and Tian do in the ancient classics. The Tao seems to act consciously, nourishes, protects, rewards the good, helps the weak, and shows mercy to sinners. There's an argument from cultural context or literary parallel that I think is very powerful that Yuan does not really go into, but I think is also worth mentioning. Like Shangdi and Tian in the classics, divine action is mirrored in this world by the sage. So in the ancient classics, you have Shangdi or Tian, God in heaven, and then the sage on earth is supposed to be obeying him, creating things as Shangdi presumably creates or makes things as well, founding dynasties, and then in later Chinese tradition, you don't necessarily need to be a king in order to be a sage. You can be someone like Confucius, for example, who creates through his words, who creates through his teachings, who created Chinese culture, indeed, through his teachings. In the Dao De Jing, we see the same parallel between the Tao and the sage. So in the earlier classics, we have Huang Tian Shang Di. We have God in heaven, and then we have the sage on earth following his righteous guidance. In the Dao De Jing, we have the Tao in a very similar relationship with the sage on earth. And then sometimes we even see the word Tian or heaven used as an adjective to describe the Tao, heavenly way. And that is a very theistic term in much of ancient China. Not every time it's used, but many times it's used. Dao De Jing ascribes a range of divine characteristics to the Tao, defining by traits or actions. The most prominent term for God in the late Zhou, Tian, is sometimes theistic in parallel or combination with the Tao, so that's common usage. The Tao dominates the Dao De Jing as Shangdi and Tian dominate the book of history and the later part of the book of poetry, borrowing many of the same functions. In fact, the Tao is to the sage as Shangdi and Tian are to sage rulers in the ancient classics. And you also find a few smoking gun type sayings in the Tao Te Ching, such as the way of heaven has no favorites but is always on the side of the good person, clearly substituting Tao for Tian or Shangdi, and showing that the Tao probably should be understood as somewhat theistic, somewhat similar to God in the Bible. Conclusions. Where did the word God come from, anyway? What does the word God mean? God is an ancient Germanic term whose origin is not entirely clear, apparently. It seems that the Tao actually has far more characteristics of Yahweh than the word God does, even in ancient Germanic, as far as I can tell etymologically. There are, however, some differences. The Tao creates rather slowly and indirectly. You could say that the Tao is kind of a laissez-faire God. There is no "thou shalt not worship idols" in the Tao Te Ching, and there are also no idols or very strong references to other gods. Well, you might argue, isn't Lao Zi's book used by magicians and pantheists in later centuries? Is that really what the Chinese Taoist tradition is all about? Really, is it theistic? That's true, but the Bible is also used in ways like that too. Can Christians learn from Lao Zi? I think so. I especially like Lao Zi's description of the creation. One could read the story of origins in this way. The Big Bang gave birth to elementary particles. Elementary particles gave birth to first-generation stars made of hydrogen and helium. First-generation stars supernovaed. Supernovas gave birth to planets. Planets gave birth to life. But throughout this entire process, while you can see it as evolutionary, you can also see it as the hand of God creating, whether directly or indirectly, whether interfering in that process or not. So can Taoists learn from Jesus? In the beginning was the Tao. The Tao was with God. The translators of the Bible thought so. The Tao became flesh and dwelt among us. And also, as you see behind me, this is the first record of Christians who came to China, erected in 781 AD. And you can still find this monument in the monument forest in Xi'an. This is a copy of the Nestorian stele. And in this copy of the Nestorian stele, 8 lines over here, the author begins to describe the practices of the first Christians to come to China. And he begins to talk about the Tao. And he actually cites the Tao De Jing in this passage. So the very first Christians began to make use of this concept of the Tao when they explained their message to the Chinese people. In the 19th century, James Legge was living in Hong Kong, on Hong Kong Island, and the abbot of a Taoist monastery on Luofu Mountain, what's now across the border in Guangdong province, I've climbed it, it's about 3,000 feet high. A Taoist abbot came to visit him, and this abbot had been studying the Tao Te Ching for 50 years. And James Legge explains, he told me that his study of the Tao of Lao Zi for 50 years had convinced him of his impotency to attain to its ideal, and he'd almost resigned himself to despair, hopeless of finding some truth for which his heart yearned. Well, he read about the life of Jesus, and he came to see Jesus as the fulfillment of this truth within the Tao Te Ching, which he was searching for. It was as if the scales fell from my eyes, he said. Dr. Legge compared him to Simeon awaiting the consolation of Israel. And Legge argued that where Taoist philosophers focused on the Dao De Jing, they were very much ready to hear from Jesus and to recognize Jesus as a fulfillment of what they were seeking for. Well, we'll talk about that more next time, Jesus and the Tao. But now you know why this podcast is called The Wind of the Tao. And you also know why the first Christians who came to China in the 7th century AD, and then the 8th century AD, and even the translators of the Bible in the 19th century were attracted to this term Tao and thought it as connected in some way to the ultimate truth in the Christian faith.